Good morning, everyone. My name is Dan, and first off, I would like to thank you guys for inviting me here to speak. Having started this project about 4 years ago, this, I think, is the coolest thing that I've gotten to do with it. So thank you very much for having me. It's really interesting to meet all of you. So I'm here today to talk about the story of how the Appium project came to be what it is. This is a fairly non-technical talk mostly, but given that I had a whole hour to speak with everybody, I also lumped in sort of the 10 secrets of Appium that I show people. So there's a lot of pro tips and very advanced things that only a few inner circle of Appium know. Jonathan doesn't even know about some of these things. Maybe he does. We'll see. There may be things, that's a better way to put it. There may be things in here that even Jonathan doesn't know about. I used to call it 10 things you do not know about Appium, but if I tell people, then they know it, and it's no longer unknown. Anyway, so I guess let's see it moving. I have down.
Yeah. No.
Oh, the down arrow.
Yeah, there you go.
Oh, there we go. Wonderful. So, my name is Dan Cuellar. I created Appium many moons ago, or what's now called Appium is probably a better way of phrasing it. It was not called Appium at the time. I graduated with a Bachelor's in Computer Science from Carnegie Mellon University. I currently work as head of software testing at a company called Foodit in London. We make restaurant technology, point-of-sale systems, online ordering, things like that. Previously, I was head of testing at companies like Shazam, which is the music recognition app that I don't think is very popular in this country, and Zeus, which is a very popular online dating site in America and other places in the world, but also not China. And then way back in the day, I worked in places like Microsoft on products you may know and love, like Outlook and Excel, and I've worked on other things before that. So that's a little bit about me, and I have a challenge for you all. This photo of me is 4 years old, and I would like a better one. So feel free to use flash photography and take lots of photos, because I would like to update this at future conferences. I am much younger in that photo, and I would like a more accurate photo to take to conferences. So anyways, two of these things. So Appium, we'll get there. But for now, let's talk about how it came to be. I guess one other thing I'd like to say, I'd like to prematurely thank the women in the box doing the translation. I know that I'm difficult to translate. This will probably be very, very painful for the next hour for them. And so I very much appreciate what they're about to do. I don't exactly speak as clear and concisely as Jonathan, and so they're about to be taken through a whirlwind of borrowed words, idioms, I don't know, other things like that, and hopefully it all translates out okay. So we put them in a box, they can't escape, they have to do this, but hopefully it works. And thank them very much for doing so. So anyways, it all started with what I like to call the most terrifying 5 words in testing. So I had just taken a new job at a dating site called Zeus.com. At the time, I believe it was one of the 5 most popular dating sites in the world. It would later become even more popular, and then less popular since. But one thing that they had that was very new to me was this. I had come from working on desktop products like Excel and Outlook and websites and things like that. I had never dealt with the App Store. And this is the key reason that Appium came to be. This, and I'll explain why. The way that the App Store is different from, say, a website is that Apple controls the distribution channel with a website, you can release code whenever you want. Your customers will open their browser and talk to your server, which has the code. So if you ever want to update something, it's quite fast. In the case of an iOS app, there's a lengthy review process that takes in the neighborhood of a week or two to complete, and even in an expedited situation, 2 or 3 days. So when you make a mistake, you have to live with the consequences for quite some time. You can't just deploy a patch to the server and fix it for all your customers. You have to wait for it to be in the App Store, and you have to wait for all of your customers to decide to hit the update button. And so mistakes are quite costly. Whereas on the web, if you make a mistake, you can fix it instantly, and all your customers immediately get the working code and the bug disappears quite quickly. So there's enormous financial implications to terrible bugs on an app that don't exist on the web. And with the web being so popular as it was before the App Store came about, development processes had come to customize themselves and tailor themselves towards the web paradigm of shipping software, meaning that mistakes were not considered to be all that bad. It was more important to iterate rapidly and constantly release new code to customers and try things out and experiment than it was to produce a rock-solid, well-tested product, because you could fix any mistakes you made quite quickly. So that brought about this problem. I have a new job. I'm in charge of keeping this dating site rolling in the money, and I have a platform that is very, very costly to make mistakes on. And I thought to myself, this all sounds a bit familiar to me. What is this really? This is like CDs. For those of you who are old enough, and you may remember that software used to come on these round-shaped things made of, what are they made out of? Does anyone know? Silicon, really? I think they're plastic or glass or something. I don't know. Anyway, computers used to have these trays that you put a CD into, and it would spin it around, and there'd be a laser on it, and it would read data off of it, and you used to actually go to a store and pick this kind of stuff up. In America, this hasn't happened for a decade or so, but maybe it still happens here. I don't think so. But anyways, shipping an app to the App Store is a lot like printing a CD. When you print a CD, it costs money. It costs, I think these things cost 5 to 10 cents each to print. So when you make a mistake, you have to reprint them all and throw away a lot of material, and it's quite costly. And you somehow have to get this into the hands of all your users, which is quite challenging, given that you usually don't have their addresses and you can't mail it to them, and et cetera, et cetera. But this App Store problem is the same problem, sort of, at a lesser magnitude. It's that now customers have to come to you to get it, and you have to go through something, in this case printing, in the case of the App Store, the review process to get it to them. And I thought, what would I do back in the day when I worked on this kind of stuff at the beginning of my career? And I was reminded of UI automation. So web has had UI automation since around, or really reliable UI automation since around 2002, when the first couple of versions of Selenium were released. And I thought, why can't we do this for mobile? So that's the wrong way. So I took a look at what was out there, and frankly, it all sucked. Everything was not great. I won't delve into these individually, as most of them aren't in use anymore, but they all had problems ranging from requiring you to code in one language, a language that was frequently different than the one you wrote the app in. Some of them also were very, very low level, in that it was more like talking to circuits on a circuit board than it was how a user would think about talking to a phone. That sort of thing. And then some of them also ran in sandboxes, so they were hard to get things in and out of and very difficult to work with. So I thought, wouldn't it be great if there was a tool like Selenium that was quite easy to use? You could use whatever language you wanted, and you could just talk to the device in real time at a very user level of abstraction, instead of at other levels. So that, I keep hitting the wrong one, is where Appium came about. So Jonathan gave you an hour on what Appium is, so I will just summarize it in 2 sentences. It is an implementation of the WebDriver protocol for mobile applications. That's all it is. It's just an implementation of a protocol that translates that protocol into calls to into calls vendor-provided good solutions for automating devices. It's also currently, from what many people told me, the most popular mobile functional testing framework on the market. And I'll go ahead and I'll skip this next slide because Jonathan gave this better than I could ever do it. And he's also explained that. So let's move ahead. So how did this all happen? So it all started when I, back in 2011, applied to speak at a conference in London called the Selenium Conference. And I applied to speak about something entirely different. I had a cool test architecture that I wanted to show people. And I applied, and they accepted my proposal, and I got a ticket out to London. And I ended up giving this talk, but something people saw in this talk distracted them from what I was actually trying to talk to them about. As part of the cool test architecture I was showing, it was automating mobile phones using shared code that it was also using to automate our website. So we'd have one test, and it would run against a phone, and it would run against a website. And people thought that was cool, but they were more interested in how are you driving the iPhone to do all that stuff? They said, is it UI automation? And I said, not really. You know, how does it work? And so I ended up giving a talk at the end of the conference on how it works. And literally nothing happened for 4 months. Like, everyone applauded, everyone said, good job, that's amazing. I had a few follow-up conversations, and then there was darkness for 3 months. And then I got a call from the CTO of Sauce Labs at the time, who was co-chairing the conference, and he saw the tool I had, and he said, oh, this is great. We've been looking for a solution for mobile automation to integrate into our test cloud. And we're having a conference in a few months where we're going to bring together a lot of people who've done work in this area, and we're going to have them all get together and meet about all the different approaches they've taken, and we'd like you to come. So I come to this thing, and unbeknownst to me, some people had already taken what I put out there and run with it and not told me about it, which is a common theme of this talk, that no one tells me anything. And I went to the talk and I saw all sorts of cool technologies, many that would become very popular later, many that wouldn't, and met lots of interesting people. Basically any mobile technology that now is popular was at this conference. And we all met and put together, and at the end of it, the CTO of Sauce Labs got up and sort of called the fight and declared that Sauce Labs really liked Appium, that they were going to put it in their cloud. And so having worked there for 5 years, I knew very little about open source software beyond things I'd done in university. But I knew very little about how it worked. And so I imagine many of you also work for larger companies with similar attitudes towards open source software. Maybe not. But there's a lot to learn about how it works and how it's different than the proprietary space. And I hope to share that with you. And so, on that note, let's sort of talk about how the Appium project grew. So for the first year of the project, Jonathan and myself, and a few others, we answered about every question that people posted to the forum. Personally. You may have noticed this does not happen anymore. we're not able to answer many of the questions you asked today. But when the project first started, it was quite important because this was a new technology and no one really understood what it was. There wasn't a community around it to answer these questions. So it was very important that me and Jonathan and the 3 other people that worked on this thing at the time were there to do that. And that helped grow a community, which would then later provide that support to some degree. But very well, I would like to say that we have one of the most active communities of any project I've seen. Most open source projects are like talking to a piece of rock, and I'd like to think we do better than that. We also answered a lot of Stack Overflow questions. We literally flew around the world and would speak anywhere that would have us. We went on some pretty bad trips. I don't know what Jonathan's worst trip is, but I once took a 13.5-hour flight to talk to 30 people for 30 minutes, which is pretty disappointing. I literally could have talked to more people while waiting on the airplane than I did at that conference. But I think it was important that we would go anywhere and we would talk to anybody. And it started to catch on places. One of the other important things we did from the very beginning was state the purpose of our tool, which Jonathan talked about earlier. What makes it different? Why does it exist? It exists so that you don't have to use a specific language. It exists to use existing protocols. It doesn't require you to modify your application. That's why Appium exists. That's what makes it different than the other tools on the market. And that was very important because when people wanted to talk about the tool, we had this clear mission that explained what it was. And it wasn't like, oh, it's a mobile automation framework. There's a bunch of mobile automation frameworks. But this is really the only one that does it like this. That's sort of true, I'm not sure. And I guess lastly, never mind, I'll skip that one, not so much. So one of the funnier things that I found as it got bigger, I started doing less and less on Appium, to where it is now today, where most of what I do is come up here and talk to people. I occasionally write some code now, but I think I went 6 months without a single line of code in the repository recently. It was sort of a dark period in my life. but for most of the project, I work on little side things, and the people like Jonathan handle the server and the more centralized stuff. So it just sort of started to take on a life of its own, much like Frankenstein here. It started walking and moving, and I wasn't involved anymore. No one told me anything. So one day, someone said, oh, I implemented for Android, and they committed to the project. Hadn't planned on doing that, but awesome. Now it's a cross-platform mobile automation solution. Great. One day, the people at Sauce threw up a website and a Twitter account. That was pretty cool. And then we had a way to share it with people. At one point, people decided, I was a little bit involved in this, to port the code to another language. So originally, this app was written in C#. Actually, sorry, it was originally prototyped in Python. And then for my job, our whole automation system was in C#, so I ported it over to C#. And then I tried to share the C# code with the open source community. And given that C# until last year was a closed source technology, they didn't know what to do with it. So then I gave them the Python version, which is a very open source language, and they knew what to do with it from there. And the answer apparently was ported to JavaScript, which at the time JavaScript was one of the 2 or 3 programming languages I didn't know. Probably know all of the others, so they had to pick one that I didn't know. But in the end, I'll talk about later why I think that was a good decision. One of the funnier things that happened was, at one point I tried to commit something to the repo, and I didn't have permission anymore. And I'm not exactly going to explain what happened there, but that's sort of the life it took on its own. It was to the point where I had somehow no longer become the administrator of it, and I couldn't even check into it. That's since been fixed, obviously, but it was kind of funny that that even happened. And then I think the most amazing thing was about 6 months after the Mobile Test Summit, I applied to speak at a conference, and I received a rejection email from the organizers saying, we're sorry to reject your proposal to speak at this conference, but we already have 2 Appium talks that we've accepted for this conference. And for me, I had no idea that anyone else even used this junk. I had no idea. And so At first I was kind of disappointed because I really wanted to go to wherever the hell it was, but I don't remember. But on the other hand, I was like, oh my god, this is really cool. There's 2 other people that want to talk about this stuff. And I didn't pay them, I didn't bribe them. They have decided of their own free will that they want to go somewhere and talk about this. That's really neat. So moving on from that idea, another thing that will happen as a project matures is that it needs to scale. Eventually, you won't be able to answer all the forum questions. We currently get, I would imagine, several dozen forum questions a day at least. More? Hundreds? Hundreds of questions out this time. Probably at least 100 a day. If I did nothing but answer those questions all day, I still wouldn't be able to do it. Not to mention that I don't get paid to work on this. This is sort of something I do in my free time. So eventually that happens. But because we always posted our answers on a forum, and we answered so many questions early on, we had built up a community full of people who were more than capable of handling 90% of the questions, which would usually be the same 10 beginner questions that everyone would ask. And so it was quite nice that 90% of it would take care of itself, and then at some point Jonathan and I and some of the more, I guess some of the older people on the project could then go in and pick off the harder ones. Eventually that even becomes harder to do because then there's so many hard ones you can't do it, but that's sort of how it happens. Something else that'll happen is that you won't be able to give each check-in and commit the thorough love and attention that you did the original ones. And this is a lesson that we're paid for right now. Jonathan talked about Appium 1.5. Unit tests are your friends. Integration tests are also your friend, but you should have less of those friends. We didn't do a very good job of writing unit tests for the initial Appium, and it has caused some of the last few releases of Appium to be less stable than we'd like them to be. And hopefully a few months from now, when Appium 1.5 is released, or whenever it is released, we'll have that testing in place so that going forward, we can add all the new stuff that comes out without causing pain for all of our users. And then lastly, what happens is you no longer really know what goes on anymore. When you have 150 or so contributors, or what we have, I don't know what they're all thinking, what they all want to do, what they're all doing at any one time. No one really does. And so, used to, there was 4 of us. I mean, we divvied up. Maybe we go and it's like, you work on that, I work on that. When you have, hundreds of companies using your product and hundreds of contributors, it's hard to know who's going to do what. And that's when having very thorough code reviews, drafting really, really detailed release notes will pay off in the end. That way all of your users can read those and know what's happened to the product, and then everyone in the project can also know what's going on. So I think if I could sum up this whole part of the presentation in one slide, this is the slide. If there's anything you take away from this, this is it. This is how open source software works and how it doesn't work. And so coming into this project, having worked at a large software company who had an adversarial approach towards open source software that has since, in the last year, sort of smoothed over and now become a more welcoming approach, but back then not so much. On the left we have the wrong way to work on an open source project, and on the right we have the correct way. And so one thing I did at the beginning was I wrote the automation framework in C#, and I shared it with people. And while C# as of last year is an open source framework, in 2011 when we started this, it wasn't. And so I handed this code over and tried to ask for contributors. Open source contributors don't tend to work in C#. It's not their language. It would be like me coming here and speaking Japanese to you. It would do you no good. You need to work in languages that the open source community works in. JavaScript is a very popular open source language. I would say even more popular than Python and other things that we've used in the past. And when we converted over to JavaScript, our contributions went through the roof overnight. So that's my first piece of advice. If you have a cool idea you want to share with people, use an open technology like Java or Python or JavaScript. Don't use C#. Don't use, Windows, I don't know, something like that that's closed source. Make it run everywhere, right? and use technologies that the community is comfortable with that are open as well. A second thing I did, and I always thought I was being very nice doing this, but I realized now that it was not nice. I would always personally reply to people with email when they had a question. And while people really appreciated getting a letter from the guy that writes the thing, I ended up having to write that same email 100 times because no one could read that other person's email. I sent it to just them. So this is where message boards come in. If people ask questions on message boards, and we answer them on message boards, Baidu or Bing will index them, and then everyone can find the answers. If we reply to email, it's just for that one person, and you end up having to do it over and over again. It's bad. Another thing that we did at the beginning is I would provide no documentation. I would say, oh, just read the code, which every developer in their life has told somebody that knows that it's the wrong thing to do. You need really good documentation. I think the people here from Tester Home and the others who worked on the Chinese documentation have done a great service to us because just having that there makes the community a lot stronger. I think it's one of the most important contributions of anybody, if not the single most, is the translation of the documentation, because it just makes it that much more accessible to everybody. Another thing, which I'll wrap up, is that I never posted my slides for my talks. So occasionally they would end up on YouTube and people would see them there, but a lot of times people want to look at the code samples and want to copy and paste. And that's just something I should have done from the beginning. I have a little section here on when disagreements happen in open source projects and how to deal with conflict. It's very different from what I would do in the workplace, and I thought it was interesting to sort of speak about. So one thing that makes dealing with conflicts on the Appium project quite easy is that we have a mission. We have 4 clear goals. And frequently decisions we have to make involve judging them against those 4 goals that we have, that we put on the board. If you have a mission, it makes sort of arguing about it a lot more clear. You know, because if you're going to change the direction of your project, that's one thing. But if you're just going to implement a new feature, that's another thing. I guess the other thing I would say is there's no real rigid chain of command in open source, right? In the workplace, if you and a coworker have a disagreement, there's usually a manager, and they would be the person to settle the dispute. In an open source project, while Jonathan is the architect of Appium, I created Appium. I don't manage Jonathan, he doesn't manage me, he doesn't manage anyone that works on the project. So to some degree, we really can't tell them what to do, right? Or we can't make the decisions that way. There's not one single point. There's a select group of us that have the ability to merge pull requests into the project and commit things. But we have a discussion around it. It's very different than if me and a coworker had a conflict. Another difference, I would say, is in the workplace when you have disagreements, you wouldn't normally want people to air their grievances out in the open. In America, that might result in someone getting shot or something. Or generally, the human resources department would be quite unhappy with people yelling at each other in the workplace. On an open source project, I feel this is the exact opposite of that. Having these debates in the public sphere enables the community to learn why you're doing what you're doing, and it helps grow the knowledge base, the understanding of what direction you're taking and why you're taking it. So it's also good because there is no manager to make the decision, so you really can't have it in private anyway, because the group has... anyways, and lastly I would say one interesting aspect of open source software is that sometimes when there's a tough decision, it's sort of like whoever writes the code has made the decision. So frequently something needs to be done, and if no one wants to do it and someone does it, sometimes that's just what happens, right? I try to think of a good example of this on the Appium project, but this has happened.
All of your submissions are like that.
I'm the worst about this, probably. Me and Bootstrap, we do this a lot. Like there was a GUI for Appium, and had we had a meeting, I don't think we would have agreed upon writing a native Mac GUI for Appium. However, since I'm the one that's going to write it, I don't know JavaScript, so a web GUI is sort of out of the realm for me. But I do know Objective-C and I do know C#, and that's how we end up with the Windows and the Mac GUIs being separate. In future versions of Appium, it is quite possible we will move to a cross-platform, Linux-capable, web-based inspector. But in the meantime, that was one decision that happened like that. There's another one that we'll get to a little bit over there. Anyway, another interesting thing about conflicts on the open source project is that losing contributors is bad, but it's not as bad as losing an employee. If I were to fire somebody on my team, I would no longer get any benefit from them. They would leave, they would probably tell people horrible things about me and what an unfair person I was. When a contributor decides to leave a project, which I think has happened once or twice, we're a pretty low drama project. It's not necessarily the worst thing that can happen. Because they're likely to stay in the open source community, barring you haven't done something so heinous that they've sworn off open source software altogether, you can still look at the work they're doing, and they can still contribute to your project, really, because it's open source. If another project comes up with a great solution to something, we at Appium can take it and bring it to Appium. It's no skin off our back, right? Multiple projects doing the same thing isn't a bad thing. Competition brings about innovation. So while it would be nice to have a harmonious open source society where everyone works on the one project that is the best at everything, it's really impossible to determine that without having a bunch of projects trying different things and seeing what works. There are other projects that do mobile automation that take a very different approach than Appium. There's the Calabash project, which will let you embed a server into your application, modifying the app under test, and provides a very integrated, BDD-driven Ruby development environment. For some people, that's what they really want, and that's a great solution. But it's not in the goal of what Appium's trying to do. That being said, there are things that that project has solved and done that we've taken over to Appium. When new versions of Xcode and iOS have come out, there have been issues that we've encountered that we've seen the Calabash people solve that we've then brought over. Little things here and there. And the same is true with other projects. There's a tool we use called Instruments Without Delay, which was developed for a project called iOS Driver, which is very similar to Appium. And it allowed us to save a lot of time running commands on iOS and make them run a lot faster. That's not something that we developed in Appium, but it was something cool that came out of the competition that because it was open source, we were then allowed to integrate. So it's a lot like university where everyone shares ideas and everyone sort of benefits from that. It's not like the private sector where Nokia doesn't want Samsung to know how their stuff works. It's quite different. And I guess in the end, the people will choose the best thing, I guess is the one thing I've learned. I frequently doubted because large companies have backed other frameworks or things like that have happened that Appium will continue to exist. This has been a good week for Appium, actually. We've had two very big people switch over to Appium. There's a company called Xamarin who writes a cross-platform mobile app framework in C#, and they've recently brought on Appium to have the same level of support as their existing tooling. So now their users will have a choice between Appium and what they currently use, which is huge for us. I think there's over 200,000 registered developers on Xamarin who all write cross-platform mobile apps, and a lot of them do testing, and that's really big. And there's another one that I know a little bit less about. But there are points when big companies have said, we're going to go with this thing, that I've been like, well, maybe it's all over. Hasn't happened yet, but I still worry every day that this weird ride I'm on will at some point stop, and I'll have to get off. But it's just getting crazier and crazier. I feel like we're just at the top right now. Beijing is pretty cool. So anyways, Jonathan's already did this slide, but I'll sort of talk about it. So, actually here I talked about it, why I do it twice. So now I'm going to move on to a different portion of the presentation. So because I had so much time, I had an hour, and I know this talk takes about 40 minutes when I normally give it. I've thrown in a bonus section with 10 secrets about Appium that everyone should know. And I'm going to have to go over to my computer over there to demonstrate some of these. So one is AppleScript. So I will quickly show you what AppleScript is for the 99% of you that aren't Jonathan Lips, who don't know what it is. He only knows because I've shown this before when he's been around. So one neat thing you can do with Appium is you can control it with AppleScript. AppleScript is a scripting interface Apple provides with all the applications on OS X. It's used to drive not the UI of the applications, but the functionality of them. While it can be repurposed to do UI automation, it's not a UI automation tool. It's a workflow automation tool. So I'm going to make a new script. So Appium is fully AppleScriptable, meaning every function in Appium can be talked to with AppleScript. So if I want to launch Appium, I can say that. I think that's correct. Maybe not. Let's open Appium first. All right. So if I want to start the server, I can do this. And oh, that's what it is. There we go. And watch, my Appium server is running now. Pretty neat. If I want to stop it, I can say stop server, and it will stop. If I want to clear out the log, there it goes. So you can find all of this functionality in the dictionary. And you can see every single thing you want to do in Appium, every setting, can be controlled through here. While this isn't really all that useful if you are familiar with the command line switches, it can be useful for other things. We like to use the GUI for Appium when we run our tests instead of using the binary, because when we have a problem, we can pause the test and the inspector's already connected to the app, and it's quite easy to go in and look at stuff. But that being said, it's sort of just for fun, so that's why it's secret. So let's move on. I have a better surprise later, but you have to wait for it. Number 9. A lot of people have been asking me questions, and while Sauce Labs is a sponsor of this conference, and I will say they provide one of the better Appium implementations in the cloud, there are many others. There are more than I can include on this slide, but if you don't want to host your own Appium, there are a lot of people that will do that for you. And some of them, I'd like to call out Testroid, have made some really cool advancements to Appium that they then shared with the community. Testroid is a company that focuses on Android real device testing. They're based in Finland and Poland. And they wrote some tools to let you do visual recognition of elements to allow you to identify UI components using pictures. And it's quite useful for games that don't implement the accessibility hierarchy in the way that normal form-based applications and things like that would. There's also Sauce Labs, which dedicates 3 or 4 full-time people to Appium, which is a much larger contribution. But there's several others here, so check them out. This is another one that's actually getting more interesting lately. I wrote this project about 2 years ago that allowed Mac apps to be controlled via Appium, and I'll sort of show you what it looks like real quick. The interesting thing is that because the new framework for El Capitan and iOS 9 supports the same framework for Mac apps and iOS apps. So in reality, we may get this for free in the next version of Appium due to the fact that the framework that Apple uses for their Mac and iOS apps is the same now. There actually wasn't a Mac framework before. So let's do this. So I'm just going to show you a simple example. I've made a server here, and I'm just going to run it. This is the Appium for Mac server, which once the new Appium is out, could be easily integrated into Appium. Right now it's a standalone project. And I have some examples that I'll show you. Let's see, there's one called, what is it called? Not a calculator. So what this is going to do is it will launch the calculator app and run a test calculation on it. And this is a Mac app running on my machine. And you'll see, generates 2 random numbers, types it in, all done over WebDriver. Same protocol that Appium uses, same that Selenium uses. Quite fast too. Anyways, so just so you know that's out there, and if anyone here wanted to contribute to it, you'd be my best friend, because that project has laid dormant for quite some time. But it still works. I guess no one's making Mac apps anymore. And if they are, they're usually web-based or something. So anyways, did I close my PowerPoint? I did. Let's find where we were. I'll just show this, I won't go back. There's also a recorder for Appium. Has everyone seen the recorder? Who here has seen the recorder? I wish I had Jonathan at all my talks. It'd be subversive. I'll give a quick demo of it. So let's do this only. Let's do that. So I'm going to launch an application here on the iOS Appium. No. I'm trying to install it to a device.
You have your UVID in there.
Oh, that's one. We're going to make the settings better too eventually. I get confused by them too, so don't feel bad about it. The nice thing though is you can actually open and save them, and had I not been frantically trying to get a later demo to work for today, I would have actually just redone these and reloaded them. Actually, I think I have some. Yeah, I do.
Are you right at schedule? 6, 8.3. Or the right iOS version?
Maybe I don't. I just upgraded this. That's a mistake before any conference talk. Never upgrade ever. Xcode, not Appium. You should always upgrade Appium, but read the release notes.
I don't think you had 8.3. You had 8.4.
Oh, I need to, I know what it is. I don't want to take too long with this demo because I think I could just show the montage, you know?
Montage.
I'll just play the montage. You know what? Why? I better have it on here. There we go. I have it in high def too. What do you know? This is a very old version of the app. So this is the recorder in action. Here's the recorder. You'll see we're performing actions. Actually, we don't need the music. And it's generating code for us in the bottom. So anyway, you see there, we perform an action and it's generating code in the bottom. So that's a neat thing you can do with the record button in the Appium Inspector. Let's move on because that's old. It's old news. Next thing I will show you is you can upgrade Appium without upgrading your Appium application. So a lot of times when a new version of Appium Server is released, there's a deluge of people on the message board saying, when is the Windows and Mac app going to come out? And as I'm the only person right now that knows how to build them apparently, sometimes that can take a while. I don't know, anyways. So the truth is you don't really need me to go make a new version of the app. You can do it yourself. And let me show you how to do that. So in the Appium app, under this settings, the developer settings, you can use an external Appium package path. So if you download the source code from GitHub and you build it, if you put that path there and check that box, Appium will use the server code that you have checked out, which can be as up-to-date as you like it to be. It won't have to be the one that ships with the app. We bundle a version with the application when we build it, but you can use one that you have on your own machine. This is also really useful for me when I'm working on the Appium server. I can use the GUI with the server code that I'm developing on. So it's quite useful for developing Appium as well. Let's move ahead, and I can make these slides come back. There's the play slide button. Slideshow. Yes, PowerPoint, that's what I wanted to do. All right, so this, as we promised earlier, I'll bring the volume back for this. You may have been wondering, why did Jonathan sing a song in front of you earlier? Was it just that he's a good musician? Well, actually, he wrote this song for a purpose. The purpose was to demonstrate Appium's ability to automate multiple devices at once. And I will show you what it looks like when that happens. Oh. Can I not play the video? Did it just... I may have copy and pasted a screenshot of that, but I have the video. We'll get to that later, if we have time. Jonathan already talked about the awards that Appium has won. I'll move along. Another thing a lot of people don't know is that we support Objective-C. So a lot of developers say, great, but Selenium doesn't support Objective-C. It does, and I know this because I wrote it. So if you go and look for the Objective-C bindings, they're actually on the official Selenium website. You can download them, and you can write your tests in the same language as your iOS application. And hopefully Swift is coming soon. I haven't had time to work on it, but someday I'll do it. Another secret Jonathan talked about was Selendroid. A way that we secretly support all versions of Android is that we leverage another project known as Selendroid, which uses an older API to automate legacy Android devices. So if you pass in the automation name capability Selendroid, you can get Appium to run Selendroid server instead of the Appium server under the hood for you and handle all that. And you can automate, at this point, 5- and 6-year-old Android phones if you really need to do that. And last, this is the most important surprise of all. I know Jonathan knows what this is, and he's shaking his head. Something at him. So, how many of you knew that Appium has a robot? No. Anyway. So, Appium has full robot integration for iOS at the moment. It's trivial if someone wants to add it for Android, but it's sort of pointless. It's just a cool demo that I take to conferences. And I think, once again, I copied the screenshot. But that's okay, because I actually have the stupid thing here with me today. So I went through a customs nightmare with this thing. I'm surprised I didn't have a full cavity search. But thankfully, your government is nicer than the American government when it comes to that. Anyway, that's probably a bad joke to make. The customs in America are just mean. I'll just say that. Anyway, so I'll explain real quick how this works, and then I'll wrap all this up, and we can all go have lunch. But what this is a robot built by someone who used to work on the Appium project a little bit more than he does now. And it takes all of your touch actions on Appium, instead of sending them to the automation API, it sends them to this little friend of ours who has a finger suspended between some robot arms, and he can touch a phone. So, I will show you. Here. Just give me a minute to set it up. So now, I'll tell him to tap that. you see he tapped the text field. And if I would like him to type something now, I can select the text field, and I'll have him type China for the win. And hopefully, if the stars align, he will type that. And you can reuse your existing Appium code with this. It's sort of just for fun. I find it difficult to imagine a practical application of this. But nonetheless, it exists. It can even do some advanced interactions like a swipe. I won't show that today, but it's there. But anyways, that is Appium's robot support. That's really all I have to demo with it. Cool. So let's move on to the end of the presentation because I only have about 8 minutes left. So let's unplug the robot. The stir has been caused. I do need to finish my presentation real quick. So how does it all work? I'm not going to show you the whole routine as it's kind of boring, but it takes about a minute. What happens is we have a calibration app for the robot. We lower the finger on the robot. We have it touch a point on the screen. It records the screen coordinates of that point as returned by Appium. It then picks like north and west, 2 more points. From that we can build a translation matrix, and we can map any 2 points between the robot's physical world coordinate system and the automation UI screen coordinate system that UI automation provides, or UI Automator would provide. If you're interested in the math, fortunately I didn't have to translate this. It's just basic linear algebra. If you have 3 equations that represent something, or 2 equations, 2 unknowns, you can build a matrix and you can solve anything you want to solve. So we build a matrix and we take the inverse, and between it we can use the inverse, multiply it by the points, or by the vector, and then you can get the new points to tap. So you send Appium an element to tap. It finds the coordinates using the UI Automation API. It then tells the robot to touch those coordinates, which because of this matrix, it knows where they exist in the real world. So it's kind of fun. But anyways, that's not the key takeaway for today. I have other things I hoped you learned, and that's why I held that off to the end. I gotta catch my slides up over here. So, why did Appium succeed where other projects have not succeeded? This is my interpretation of it. From day one, there was a clear philosophy and vision. We have a mission. We know what we are. We're not just figuring it out on the fly. We knew what we wanted to be, and that's what we were. A lot of other tools will sort of add functionality over time, and they may become popular, but they have no clear purpose. And Appium has never been that way. It's never been, what else can we wedge into? I'm trying to think of a good example of a tool like this. There are many. But anyway, I'll move on. Secondly, I feel like we always made decisions around the idea of including as many people as we possibly could, which led to an active community. That slide I showed earlier with all the things I did wrong and that I eventually was taught to do right by some very sharp open source people that came onto the project. That's what I'm talking about. We supported as many languages as we could. That way, if you didn't know JavaScript, you weren't left out in the cold. We based our tool on something people already knew, the Selenium project. So already, there was familiarity with it, even though you've never used it before. We made decisions that were designed to build an active community, like I said. And we put a whole lot of work into it. Like, I have probably spent 50 nights in weird hotel rooms around the world in the last 4 years. You know, Jonathan, probably twice as many. I've probably used a month or 2 of my time just writing code for this project, which I don't get paid to work on. Jonathan and others have spent 10 times as much working on it. So, not to say that this can be done without effort. But basically, we went anywhere and everywhere would have us, no matter if it was a 13.5-hour flight to talk to 30 people, most of which didn't code. It was, you know, that's how it has to be done. You never know who's going to be important. And I guess moving on, we were inclusive. We were inclusive with, wow, some of those are transparent. Let's try this. I don't know why that's animated. We were inclusive with everywhere we went. We were inclusive with every language we supported. We were conclusive with our documentation, much more inclusive with Chinese, as we have full Chinese documentation thanks to you guys here. But also inclusive with just our idea. It's in, I believe, 9 different languages on the web. We have native Mac and Windows. We were inclusive. We didn't leave anybody out. It works with Linux. It works with anything. And I guess I can sort of sum it all up, or at least my end of it, with this one quote. I'm not a big fan of Steve Jobs. I like Apple stuff, but Steve Jobs, not a very nice person. But I feel like this quote summarizes what I've learned from the last 4 years on this project better than anything. And here's what he says. He says, life can be much broader once you discover one simple fact. Everything around you that you call life was made up by people that were no smarter than you, and you can change it, you can influence it, you can make your own things that other people can use, and once you learn that, you'll never be the same again. And I guess what I interpret this to mean in the case of Appium was that this tool was not built by the Selenium project or somewhere you'd expect it to come from. It was not built by a large company. It was not provided by Apple or Google or Microsoft. It was done with people with modest open source experience and some people with no open source experience like myself. And that's what I always like to teach people is that I am no smarter than any of you. In fact, many of you are probably smarter than me. I had a fun idea. I went to a conference. I shared it with people. The right people saw the idea eventually. And in spite of my total incompetence in running an open source project, it has managed to succeed because it can come from anywhere. You know, you don't need it to come from the heavens, right? And so every one of you who has a good idea right now, you should share it with people, and you should talk at conferences, and you should publish it as open source software. You shouldn't just keep it at the company where you work, because while it probably is not something that hasn't been done before that people are going to find useful, there is a chance that it is something that, surprisingly enough, no one has ever thought of and no one has ever shared before. And I think in the case of Appium, I've met a person who I think had a very similar idea, and he did not share it with people. And the difference between me and him, and I feel like he's probably much smarter than me, was that I chose to share it with people. And that's the one thing I would encourage, and this is sort of the message of open source software, right? When you work at smaller companies, like I work at a company with 7 developers right now, you can't compete with the large people who have these giant proprietary software packages. But open source software levels the playing field. Whereas a big bank can use Microsoft SQL, the open source community has MySQL. Whereas C# exists for the proprietary community, though it is open now, the open source community always had Java. And so I see that as sort of the purpose. There are proprietary automation frameworks out there. Some of them are quite good, but Appium levels the playing field. It's just as good as all of those. And lastly, like I said, there's someone in this room with an idea like this, and I want to make sure they know that it's not going to be overnight, it's not going to be easy, but if you share it with enough people, and you listen to people, and you take advice from people who are really, really good at this stuff, like the people at Sauce Labs, like some other people on the project, eventually good things will happen, and the most awesome thing will win in the end. So hopefully that summarized, that translated well. So anyways, it's pretty much lunchtime. I have time for questions, but I don't know if they want me to take any. It's up to you guys. Do you want me to take 5 minutes of questions, or we're over time in 3 minutes? Well, if anyone has a question, ask it, because they're not stopping me from taking questions.
有问题可以问Dan老师，好吗？但是我们今天中午的午餐是在12点半，所以我们现在就是说，时间就是看大家有可能到时候我要到此结束了，所以你们就有问题可以现在尽情问，这样子。开始问好了。
the first one. Sorry.
Lady first.
Sorry, just sorry for this conflict. But then, just wondering for the Appium compatibility of this iOS version. And Appium 1.4 is the latest version, I believe. And does it support iOS 7? Oh, sorry, 8.
The current version of Appium supports iOS 7.
But why I run every time I got instruments crashed?
That's a more in-depth problem that I think we'd want to discuss in front of everybody. But if you show it to me...
I've downloaded to iOS 7 and it works.
Once again, if there's questions that are very specific to what you want to talk about in your job, find me in the hallway. But I'd like questions that benefit the whole group would be best for the 5 minutes we have. But find me later and I'll be happy to try and answer it, though.
Just generally, it's the compatibility.
It should work.
Hi, do you think the mobile is the future for the automation test? The mobile and the machine finger?
Yes.
I think lots of issues and problems in the SDK test. What do you think about the schooling and the other OpenCV based on test automation framework?
OpenCV. Okay. I'm in general on OpenCV is a good tool to have when your hands are bound and there are no other options. It's great to have that ability. Some people, like the people at Testroid, have used it to automate video games and things like that. They're more visual and don't have the accessibility hierarchy baked in. Other apps might. So I like tools like Sakuli and OpenCV, and I'm trying to think, there's a few others I've seen. I like them, but they're very fragile, and if you change stuff, they break a lot, so they should be used wisely. But they are a very valuable tool to have in your tool belt.
Do you want to merge the OpenCV based automation test framework into the Appium to supply another way for find the enlightenment? Do you have the plan?
The people at Testroid, I believe, have a patch they want to submit, so it may happen soon.
I said, thank you.
Bug them about it on Twitter.
Hey, I have a question. Sorry. Okay, first thing first time. Okay. Hey, I just want to know more details about the in-house cloud service, just like the Source Lab, and where I can get this information and to know more about that.
So I had a slide earlier with vendors.
Maybe some website, some URL links, I can get more information about that, or have someone I can
It's
contact.
usually, let me find it. Oh, I'm not controlling the slides. Oh, by the way. Let's see, going back. Where is it? So, the in-house, there used to be a company called Purify. They were bought by Google. They had like a machine you could bring. I think Testroid has one as well. I think it's just testroid.com. I think so. I don't know about the others. I don't think Sauce or Testing Bot provides anything like that. The other two I'm not sure, but I know that Testroid has some sort of offering like this.
Okay, does Testroid offer this kind of service in China?
You would have to ask them.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
I have a question. Yes, I'm interested in the robot.
Yes.
And I want to know whether it can be very precise to locate coordinates, each coordinate in the device.
I would say, it's gotten better. It can hit keys on a keyboard, which I'd say it's about as good as a drunk human.
Drunk human.
Yeah, not a human being very careful, but a drunk human.
Is it able to to adapt people to resolutions or screen sizes?
Yes, because it pulls the coordinates from Appium, and it's calibrated to the particular device, all that just works itself out.
But for example, for web page, there are very tiny places to click, to tap. So
Yeah, I would say plus or minus 15 pixels is probably about how good it is. So if your element is smaller than 30 pixels, it's iffy. And if it's under 15 pixels, I would say it's unlikely you will hit it. But fortunately, the keys on the keyboard are about 30 pixels, so it works.
is it open source?
Yes.
喂，你好，我问几个问题。第一个就是这个那个 Appium 那个硬件模块，它大概有多少种？就除了 robot 之外的。
Good, translator, could you repeat that? It is, there's two versions of it. There's an iPad one and an iPhone one. Other than that, I've heard rumors of other ones existing, but I've never seen them. So they very well may be a couple others, but.
然后第二个就是我想问一下，就是这个东西我们如果想获取的话，有渠道吗？
Let's see. I don't imagine this website will not work. But let's see. It's open hardware, so if you go to the GitHub page, you can actually, if you have a 3D printer or a friend that has one, you can print it yourself. It's about $130 US in terms of parts, but they sell them pre-assembled if the internet is working. It's called TapsterBot. Just search for it on the web. I think it's tapsterbot.com.
哦。应该还有一个相关的问题，就是说，我看这个那个 robot 是没有 camera 没有摄像头的，它是如何把你的那个在那个软件做的那个，比如说我按键的一个动作，精准的对应成坐标。还有一个问题就是说，我假如说我从一个产品移植到另外一个产品测 APP 兼容性的话，我这个用力是如何可以快速移植？
The robot talks to the iOS accessibility APIs, the ones that Appium use, and those keys are they're in the hierarchy under a UI8 keyboard object. So no matter what the orientation or the size of the phone, because they're in the automation framework, like any other UI element in your application, their coordinates are known and reliably retrieved by Appium.
Another question. View for the robots. So can you share more about which servo are used?
I'll repeat it when he's done. So go ahead, ask it.
Yeah, more question about this robot. Which servo do you use? What servo and what port?
He asked what servo I use for the robot and what port. And my answer to that is, I don't know. I didn't build the robot, I just wrote the software. If you go to github.com/tapsterbot/tapsterbot, it's all there. Are there any non-robot related questions? Okay, she has a non-robot question.
Yes, non-robot. Yeah, hello there. I have a question. I'm just curious about how you can organize the open source project itself. And I see that there are over 1,000 people have been involved and submit code and deliver features. And how you can make an agreement, make a decision on which kind of features will be in which release, things like that.
Okay, Jonathan, do you mind? That's like a Jonathan question right there. Because the truth is, with this sort of stuff, like, I'm not the expert on it, and I leave that to Jonathan, who works on this full time. So he will have the answer to that question, as he is the one that does that. She wanted to know around how do you coordinate what goes into what release on Appium, and who works on what, and that sort of thing.
So you should join the Appium developers list. It's where we have discussions about what we're working on. Also, we create issues on GitHub when we have a project. So if you subscribe to all of the issues on GitHub, then you can see when any of the Appium developers are discussing or planning something. And if you want to participate in the conversation, you can always just add your own comment.
Yes. Is there any many branches for the project, or just one track?
Yeah, right now.
There are 2 branches right now because we're doing a rewrite, which is in its own branch. But we typically have one main branch, and when we make releases like 1.4, 1.5, we make a branch for each release so we can continue to make fixes on those branches. But we don't really usually have multiple branches of development going at the same time, usually just one. So it's easy to follow.
Okay, thank you very much.
There's one back there. And there's another one back there. There's 2.
Hello Dan, I'm Mark, I'm from Yingyu. So you mentioned that there's going to be Swift support. Is there going to be a timetable for supporting Swift? And if we support Swift, am I able to write automation cases for both Android and iOS with Swift? Thank you.
So the timetable is God knows when. I'm the one that's probably going to end up doing it because I'm the only one on the project right now, I think, that knows Swift. I started at one point, it's sitting there like 10% done. I wouldn't count on it coming anytime soon, but if someone wanted to contribute it, it's not very difficult. If you're really clever at the way you do it, you can reuse all the difficult code you wrote for Objective-C and just add a new Swift front end to it. But yeah, I wouldn't count it anytime soon. It's possible, but it's, I don't get paid to work on this and that for a lot of time.
I think we'll make one.
Okay, Jonathan says he thinks they'll make one if I don't.
And it'll be for, you can use for Android too.
Yeah, and it'll work for Android too. Swift runs, it's open source now, so the sky's the limit kind of what it can do. And there's nothing about sending HTTP requests to a server that forces it to be iOS specific. There was one more back there. There was a lady. Was there? Was it not? Oh.
我想问一个比较细节一点的问题，就是 Appium 好像是在安卓上并不支持 Toast， 我想问一下有没有比较好的解决方式？
Translator, it doesn't support what?
安卓 Toast。
Toasts. Oh, toasts.
T-O-A-S-T.
Toasts. Oh, okay. We're limited by what Apple and Google provide us. So if the underlying frameworks ever support toasts, it will happen automatically. Oh, John.
There's a forum post. Somebody figured out a way to do it, but it's not really easy.
Is it the iOS one where they use the address book or something?
No, I think this is for Android.
Oh. Check the forums, Jonathan tells me. Someone may have figured this out. I don't know the answer, though. All right, it looks like that's it. So I would just like to say thank you very much for inviting me. I am so honored to be here, and let's go have lunch.